All right, good afternoon and or morning, everybody. Some of you are probably, if you're west of us on the West Coast, it's still not noon there, so you're there. We're going to talk today about market risk. So you've covered some of the other risks associated with farming, and a market risk is just another one of those. And we combine the market risk management with the management of the other risks we have, and then we have a total risk management program for the farm. So think about this in the context of all the other risks that we're talking about, and that Mr. Rock will give us a wrap up on at the end here after I speak. He's going to kind of review all of the risks with a really solid discussion of how they interact with one another. I work for a group called Up and Farms. We do production training and marketing training and food safety training and certification under the USDA GAP program. And we work with Natural Resources Conservation Service to do some work with them on providing training and facilitation of natural resources conservation on farms. So I'm mainly working with small farmers and medium farmers. Most of my talk today is geared towards smaller farmers and medium-sized farmers. There is some stuff on things like futures contracts. So if there's someone in the audience that needs to have a very basic introduction to that sort of thing, we cover that too, because that's a great way for a large farmer, row crop farmer, animal farmer, things like that to manage market risk. So market risk includes all the risks to the profit and the operation due to activities related to the selling of agricultural products, the buying and selling of agricultural products. So some examples of market risk include risks to your supply, the inputs that are coming into the farm, whether that be fuel or right now there's a shortage of parts for tractors and things. That, believe it or not, could be a market risk. As is, there's a shortage of certain seeds in the country, in part because of the pandemic, and in part because of the drought in the Northwest, where a lot of the country's seeds are raised, as well as some import issues with getting seeds from overseas. So that's a real risk right now for 2022 that we're all going to face, and it's a market risk. My growers here, I'm in Mississippi with Rock here in Mississippi. I'm getting 2 or 3 calls a week. I can't find collard seeds. I can't find green seeds for the fall. I have others calling me saying, I can't get ryegrass seed. That's a market risk that can be managed. None of these risks, remember, we're managing and mitigating this. We're never going to eliminate risks. Stuff happens. That's just how it is. So that's supply risk. We have price risk. Just prices we pay for stuff as well as the prices we receive for the goods we're selling. We have market changes. Markets are dynamic. They do not stay static. You can think about things in your life, I'm sure, that the entire market has changed. We can all think right now of the car market right now. We're up to over 10% of the cars in this country being sold are electric cars. That's huge, and that number is only going to change and get bigger, changing the marketplace for both the car vendors and the suppliers. Think about all the things with vertical farming and stuff that's going on now. The tastes changing in the market that we have. And we'll talk about some of that stuff as we go along here. Competition. What about competition? We have competition for the goods you're buying as well as the goods you're selling, and for space in the marketplace, whatever that marketplace may be. That marketplace could be your local farmers market. It could be the national and international grain market. All of them have competition, and that's a market risk that needs to be managed. And I have this on here, and inexperience is a market risk. A lot of small and medium-sized farmers especially, and some of the bigger farmers to a degree, have what's called inexperience risk. They do not have enough knowledge yet to manage the risk as efficiently as another farmer does, and to understand the markets as well as another farmer might, or another grower might. So when I talk about something like that, it is not to disparage anyone and their level of knowledge. Not knowing something is is just something that has to be mitigated too. So it's not a calling out it is just an inefficient thing that causes a market risk. Let's go on. There we go. So let's talk about supply. So supply can be either too much or too little of something, right? It can be just right, but having too much or too little is what creates the risk. And it could be too much or too little of what you're buying into the farm to grow something like the seeds I talked about a few minutes ago. It could be too much that you're producing. It could be too much that you and your competitors are producing at the same time. Or it could be too little because of a drought that messed up the whole industry. So that's a supply risk. And again, these supply risks, weather is a big factor in supply risk in agriculture. It can be too hot, it can be too cold, it can be too wet, it can be too dry. And all of that. Quality can be an issue in supply. You might have all the tomatoes in the world, but if the market is demanding a 4-inch diameter tomato that weighs between 8 and 10 ounces, and you have 1 million pounds of 6-ounce tomatoes, you may not be able to sell those tomatoes. That's a risk. Or you may have a pink tomato, which is favored in some place like Arkansas. There's great industry of pink tomatoes. But they're not a big seller necessarily in another market. For those of you that grow sweet corn, the Angus issue in the Angus marketing that's being done in beef these days, that takes other breeds and in some markets reduces the ability to sell into that market. That's a quality issue because it's a request of the buyer to have that breed with that genetics within the animal. Timing is an issue. I think we've all been, if you've done any farmers market type work, you know that there's those 3 or 4 weeks in the middle of the summer, whatever the middle of the summer is where you are. In places like Massachusetts and Maine, I'm talking about August, maybe early September. In Mississippi, we're talking the end of June and early July, where everybody in the market has tomatoes. And if you're the first one in with tomatoes, you make lots of money. If you're trying to sell tomatoes when everybody has tomatoes, you're not going to make quite as much money. That's a market risk, and we can manage that timing risk by multiple crop planting and other things like that. But you need to think about that. You need to work on that. Uniformity of supply is an issue. Too much, too little, having the product be consistent over time. If you're a grain farmer, you know that your elevator or your buyer has specific requirements for protein content, the type of grain, the protein content, the moisture content, and other factors. If you're a fiber grower, like a cotton farmer, staple length and fiber length, and all of that thing, all of those factors play into it. And you could have part of the field that is producing the right quality and part of the field that's not producing the right quality. If you are a produce grower and you have 3 or 4 different grades of produce that you've harvested because produce is variable out of the field, you have 3 or 4 different sizes of squash set. When you might market one set to one grower or to one buyer set and another set of produce to another buyer set. And that can reduce your risk by having multiple channels. And we're going to talk about multiple channels here in a few minutes. Let's move on from that. So let's talk about price. Agriculture is tough. It probably has more price variability than any other major industry. And it always has and probably always will. That's because of weather. That's because of global competition. That's because of what's called the substitution of goods. If we don't have, if cotton got really, really expensive, well, people just start making their clothes out of polyester or linen or hemp or some other fiber. So there's competition within the commodity and among commodities. Same with beef and chicken. Beef and chicken are perfect competitors almost. Price of beef goes up too high, the sales of chicken go up. And then once the chicken supply goes down a little bit because of increased consumption, and beef consumption is reduced by increased price, but then the beef price is going to come back down. The chicken price is going to be up for a little while, and that things seesaw back and forth. We need to understand that. We need to manage that. That comes from experience. That comes from learning your market and understanding your market. Most farmers cannot be assured of their price before they sell their product. And we also have price risk on the input side. And that's not on my slide, but that's really important too. It's really important to understand that you have price risk on the input side too. Right now, the pandemic has resulted in a lot of input prices going sky high. Fertilizer price risk is huge. And anything we can do to lock in a price in advance, if we think the price is going to go up, that can help us. That can help us. That's not always the case, but it can, and you need to understand your market for that. Sometimes, if you're in a farmer's market situation, you can have great control over your prices. You have the competition of the other farmers in the market, but you can use strategic ways of managing your price there. And you can get pretty good feel for what your price is. I would argue that you don't want to, in most cases, you don't want to change your pricing too frequently in a farmer's market situation, because you can create what's called a race to the bottom. You can create a situation where if you see your neighbor selling tomatoes for $2.50 a pound and you've got them at $2.75 a pound, and you lower yours to $2.25 a pound, yeah, you'll sell a few more tomatoes, but then the next week your competitor might have it at $2 a pound, and suddenly no one's going to be making money on tomatoes once it gets to a certain point. So you have to be very careful about that. In a farmer's market, you can also use tools like bundling, where we combine 3 or 4 items in a pack, so that what seems like an individual item might be very expensive, like a nice red tomato, or a single cucumber for $1. If you make them 3 for $2, or you make them 3 for $4, the value proposition to the consumer changes a little bit. So you need to think about that. You need to understand pricing in your market. For small farmers, you have much more control over your price in general when you are doing the selling to the end user, to the consumer. If you are selling to a restaurant, or you're selling to a consumer, you're selling to your community supported agriculture, which is a box program situation, you have a lot of control over that price. The further you are from the end user, the less control generally. And this is true in commodities, animals, and fruits and vegetables, or flowers for that matter, or honey for that matter. The further you are from the end user, generally the less control you have over price. And the more strategic you have to be about managing your price and understanding the tiers in the market between you and the end user, so that you can get a fair price for your goods over time. So that can be really important. As I said earlier, markets change. They'll change all the time. What happens if you're selling to a cotton gin, say, or to a meat packing plant, or even a local butcher plant, just a few headed a month, and they close, and they're the only people you've been selling to? What do you do? How are you going to manage that? You need to understand that and manage that risk. Consolidation is a huge issue for larger farmers, especially. There are very few buyers of grain these days. There are very few buyers of large numbers of animals these days. There's less than half a dozen significant, well, I won't say significant, but large poultry integrators, writing those production contracts. And that's what we'll talk about that in a minute. And as that consolidation continues, market control and price control and market risks can shift to the farmer, and market control and price control can shift toward the buyer. And we need to understand that. That doesn't make it bad. I'm not here to call anyone out on that, but it makes it a risk we have to manage. What about changing consumer tastes? The production of organic products and the demand for organic products and naturally grown products is huge and growing. Many consumer products companies and farmers markets thrive on the natural and organic market and on non-GMO markets, but that doesn't mean there's not a market. And most of the market is still non-organic. Most of the grain grown in this country has like herbicide traits in it and stuff that have been added, making them genetically modified. And that's most of the market. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to understand where today's market is, where next year's market's going to be, where next year's consumer tastes are going to be, and where it's going to be 5 years from now. We can't. The further we get from today, the less likely there are predictions and guesses and what the experts are saying is going to be right. What we can go through as a vegetable farmer, you can go through the seed catalogs this winter. And I'm a big fan, by the way, of using the very best seed you can. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. But you can go through and you can look for trends, and you can work with your salespeople to see what is up and coming in their portfolio of products they're selling to you. And you can reduce your market risk by being ahead of the curve from some of the other farmer competitors you have to deal with these consumer tastes that are changing. One of the big vegetable seed companies a few years ago came out with a lettuce line that all the lettuce leaves tend to grow about the same size. So when you cut it, it all winds up all the same size, instead of the outer leaves being the biggest leaves and the inner leaves being really small. Well, it kind of matured, so there's less difference between the outer leaf size and the inner leaf size. That became very desirable for chefs and for restaurants to buy that lettuce. It also made it very easy for farmers to harvest it, so that reduced labor costs for them. Then there's different colors, and if you recall, we just had the kale thing, where kale was huge for a couple, 3 years. And now kale is still important, but it's not going to be the vegetable of 2023 or 2024 that it was in 2020 or 2019. It's just not. Tastes change and trends come and go. We need to understand those. Where is Angus beef going to be 5 years from now? Is it going to be the thing? Or is Charolais going to be the new, someone's going to discover that Charolais has a cool trait in it or something? I don't know. But the people in the beef industry kind of know this stuff. And we need, even as smallest farmers that we are, we need to be able to understand these trends and manage them. Then there's regulatory changes. We all know the Food Safety Modernization Act is in effect now. And in a couple of years, they'll finally have the water rules done, and the whole thing will be done. Right now, it's mostly done, except for some of the water rules. That means that we all have to follow it. We all have to follow it if we're not doing all of our stuff directly to the consumers, and our sales are under a certain amount. And I'm not going to get into all the regulations about that, but we need to understand regulatory changes. I do some gap inspections and gap audits, rather. And the farmers that want to say that they're GAP certified, they have a whole list of 170 different things they have to do on their farm. And those things change. We had a rule from 2018 or 2017. Now in 2021, they all got updated a little bit. So all the farmers had to make little changes. And that's going to continue. The changes weren't grand, but they were something that in order to maintain your certification, you had to understand and manage that. And that's a market change because they're using the certification as a marketing tool and to get into certain markets. So that's important for them. Competition. There are just a whole laundry list of competition in agriculture. And these are all market risks. Other growers and providers of the same thing that you're growing, whether they be local or they be non-local. Many of us are even in international markets if we're big enough. But for small farms, you're talking locally around your town, you're talking locally in your state or your county. You may be talking regionally if you're making a value-added product and jarring something that's going into a small chain of grocery stores or something like that. But there are people doing that same thing. And you need to be aware of what they're doing, how they're doing it, and how that impacts your sales and your margins. Margins being the difference between costs and returns. What about competitive goods? That whole thing I talked about a few minutes ago about the chickens versus cows, chickens versus beef. They're competitive goods. And yes, you need to understand what all the other chicken farmers are doing if you're a chicken farmer. But you also need to know what's going on in the beef industry. If you're a goat farmer and you're providing goat milk cheese to the local farmers market, you need to understand what the other dairy folks are doing in that market. You need to understand the competitive goods that you're facing, as well as the ones understand what's going on in the big grocery stores so that you can manage and provide the experience around your brand that serves you. What's the prices of the competition? Are they above yours? Are they below yours? Do they include certain services, or do you include services that they don't, that make your price more valuable than it might seem in just a dollar amount? All needs to be known. What's their packaging like? Are they and their point of sale displays, are they a more attractive thing than you are, or are you a more attractive product than they are? This is all stuff that we can control and we can manage. What about the service that goes around their product and your product? When you deliver your grains to the elevator, do you fuss and fume about the margin and all that stuff and make them like are you the grower at the farmer's market that curses at the customer for touching your tomatoes? You're creating extra risk when you do stuff like that. You're creating risk related to competition because no one has to buy from you. And you don't have to sell it to anyone either, but no one has to buy from you. So, and what about consistency? Is your product consistent? If you have a first-class market in a high-end market and you're selling perfect tomatoes, but at the end of the season, you've got some ratty tomatoes that are a little raggedy there, it may be wiser for you to make sauce out of them, donate them to the food bank, sell them to a secondary market that will be to put those in the box. And certainly if you have a contract with a wholesale buyer, if you've been delivering X quality to them and all season long, and on the next week, you deliver them a lesser quality product, even just for 1 week, that could be the end of a relationship. And that's a big risk we need to manage. And is your product always suitable for the intended customer? That's a good question too. And some of this, some of you on the call today, on the presentation today, some of you are new growers and you haven't been exposed to some of this risk management thinking. It's not hard. None of this is really hard. And don't worry, it sounds like it's really involved. It's really not. It's just thinking through things. A lot of this stuff is stuff you can do during the winter time. When it's cold or snowy or rainy or whatever, you can do some of this stuff. But inexperience comes from being new. It could be inexperience at having a new crop in your sphere of growing. It could be that you've just gone to a new market, and maybe you've You've been at one farmer's market and now you're going to go do one Saturday farmer's market. Now you're going to do a Wednesday market in a nearby town. You don't have any experience in that market. It's going to take a while to build the experience to reduce the market risk that market presents. I've been there many times. First market I did in one town, we did $19 the first week in a 2-hour market. The second week we did $34. The third week we did over $100 and we were off to the races. And by the time, and we don't do that market anymore. We've actually outgrown it, believe it or not. But we were doing hundreds and hundreds of dollars in a 2-hour market when we left that market. And it was great. And it was great for building our brand. New product risk could be, new input product, a new pesticide that you may not know how to manage, a new fertilizer product or a new compost product that you brought in, or a new seed that you brought in. It could be that you created a new product, that you made a new chow, or you've asked your local butcher who does your butchering for your small scale beef operation, that you've asked them to do another different cut for you. You've asked them, to change, how the oxtails are cut or whatever it is, how the chops are cut. That's a risk. And we talked about new regulations already, understanding regulations. What about buyer specifications? Your buyer specifications problem, if you're selling to any kind of contract or to anyone other than direct to a consumer, the specifications can change all the time. A chef at a restaurant might say, I'm not going to need grape tomatoes next season, but there is a new striped cherry tomato that I'd really like to have if you can grow it for me. And that's a new specification. You've got to manage that. And sometimes the answer to any of these questions, by the way, is no. Sometimes no is a great answer to risk management. Remember that. You don't have to say yes to everything. And no can be very strong. And then new competition comes in, and you have to manage and understand the new competition. So you got to be aware of it. Don't feel threatened by it. Feel energized by it. Let's talk about some management risk strategies real quick. So each farm will face and manage the risks differently. I got some tools here in the following slides that we can combine. And you're going to combine those with other tools that are relevant to your operation. And again, I think we have a broad audience today, so I'm kind of being very general, trying to cover a little bit for everybody that's out there. But you'll need to engage your professional legal, accounting, marketing, and other service providers so that you can leverage the talent and knowledge that you have as a farmer and marketer, and make sure that some of these other risks don't get you. So you can contract with input providers. You can buy seeds and compost and fertilizer and boxes and all of that stuff, and packaging services or packing services. You can contract for all of that stuff in advance, and that way you know your costs in advance, and that's a way to manage that risk. You can contract with others to buy your product, whether it be selling chickens to a poultry company or selling tomatoes to a restaurant. You might agree in advance that you're going, or a CSA is a perfect example of a contract where consumers pay a set amount at the beginning of the season, and then your contract with them is to deliver them a box of produce and whatever else is in that box once a week or once every other week, whatever it is, at a certain amount of weight, a certain amount of time every week. You have that. That reduces your pricing. Contracts can have fixed or variable prices. You can have a fixed price contract like the CSA contract, or you might have a variable price contract where it changes based on market conditions, and all of that is agreed up front. You could have a marketing contract. And a marketing contract, that's just one where you agree to provide 10,000 pounds of tomatoes a week or 1,000 pounds of tomatoes a week to a grocery store, and they take over and they sell it. Or you can have a production contract. That's actually what the poultry companies do, and a lot of the vegetable wholesale companies do. They'll do a marketing contract where they'll supply most of the inputs. They'll specify what seed you grow. They'll specify what food you give the animals or what fertilizer you give the plants. They'll specify a planting date within a few days. They'll recommend, they'll specify management during the crop, and they'll specify how it's to be harvested and delivered to the company. And so they take on a lot of risk at the end with the pricing of the sales to grocers and things like that. And in exchange for that, you have a set contract that they'll pay you X pennies a pound or X dollars a pound for the product you're growing with. Growers can contract, as I said, with seed companies, packaging suppliers, packers, and with their own growers cooperatives. You might work with other growers in your area to say, well, Joan, you go the sweet corn for harvest for week A. I'm going to grow the sweet corn for harvest for week B. You grow the sweet corn for harvest for week C, whatever it is. And this allows you all to manage risks. It allows you to spread risk and manage risk. Vertical integration. Mara talks about the poultry companies and things like that. They tend to be what's called vertically integrated. Vertical integration is a fancy word for saying that you're going to control more than one level in a market channel or value chain. And what do I mean by that? You got it from, let's take tomatoes. You got tomato seeds at the start and a piece of ground, all the way to when the consumer cuts that tomato and puts it in a salad, or a processor sells that jar of tomato sauce to a consumer, and the consumer puts it on a pizza or whatever it is, on spaghetti. You have growing, packing, processing, storing, shipping, and selling are all levels in this vertical integration. The more of these that you can control or manage, the more you can manage market risks in most cases. Most of us farmers, we control the growing. If we're a direct retailer or a direct consumer farmer, we control all of that, and we're semi-vertically integrated because we control when we plant, where we order seeds from, how we grow them, how we harvest, how we store, and how we sell our product. For larger growers, most larger farmers are not as vertically integrated. Someone raising cattle and sending them to the feedlot, they only have a small portion of all the layers of that. And so there's risk to them in not controlling those other things. But there's also reduced risk, and you got to balance that. There's reduced risk because they don't have to deal with what happens if there's a pandemic and people stop buying steak. What happens if there's a hurricane and the regional market is shut down for 2 weeks. They don't have to deal with that. So there's reasons why you could want to do vertical integration, and there's reasons why you might not want to. But it is a concept for us all to be aware of. For small farmers, the value-added thing in here and the processing and packing thing, that can be really valuable. So futures and options. This is only for the biggest growers in here, probably. Futures are contracts to buy or sell a product at a later time at a set price. They're run on exchanges around the country. You've heard of them. You've heard of the futures market. You see that on the business shows and all that stuff. Some examples of products that have futures contracts: lumber has futures contracts. All the beef has futures. Wheat and all the grains, soybeans and corn. But in horticulture, orange juice, believe it or not, has futures contracts. I think those are going away if they haven't already, though, to be honest. But there aren't that many others in horticulture. And you can also do something, but futures contracts, you agree when you buy or sell to buy or sell a certain amount of a product. So you might agree to buy or sell 5,000 bushels of wheat in December. And you might do that in May. Options are just an option to buy or sell one of their futures contracts. So, and there are options on other things, but options on futures are an option to buy or sell one of those. So you never have, with an option, unless you exercise the option, you never have to actually, there's never any risk of having to actually deliver a product if you fail to close out the contract. With the way futures work for grain farmers, for those of you that don't know, it's a way to reduce the price risk during the season for someone like a grain grower. So imagine you're a corn grower and you plant in May. And when you plant your corn, you go and you sell a futures contract for the equivalent amount, or a number of contracts for the equivalent amount. Let's say you're going to produce 10,000 bushels of corn, you think. And so you would sell 2 futures contracts for December delivery, because each contract is 5,000, so you sell 2, that'd be 10,000 that you'd have in that futures contract. And then when you sell your real corn in November, you get a certain price for it. But then you buy back your futures contract to close it out. So remember, you sold in the spring on the futures. Now you buy it back. So that zeroes out that contract. But in doing that, the price of the futures contract has changed almost equal to the price of the change, any change in the commodity price between the time you planted and the time you harvested. So that allows a grower to, in essence, pretty much guarantee a huge reduction in the price fluctuation between what they thought it would be in the spring versus what it really is in the fall. And I didn't explain that perfectly well, and I'd be happy to talk with you. I'll have my email up here in a little while, and if someone needs to know more about that, we can do that in the future. But large farmers use these things. I want to present them because if you are a large farmer on this call and you don't understand futures and options, they are great risk reduction factors in market risk for your operation. Insurance is another way that we can manage our market risk. Insurance can protect against price risks, both for inputs and for outputs. It can protect against weather risks and other market risks. Risk Management Agency, which is sponsoring these talks today, they offer all kinds of different insurance options for different kinds of risks. Most of these target larger growers of livestock and commodity crops. There are 1 or 2 programs for specialty crop growers in some instances, and I urge you to go and contact your farm service agent's office and talk to them about that. And again, I can point you towards some experts in your area on this. I am not an expert on crop insurance, though. But farmers should also have liability and product insurance, as well as other business insurances to protect their family and their businesses. And it's gotten to be, with all the food safety issues these days, that many wholesale buyers of specialty crops now require farmers to have product liability and other insurances. And the good news on that one is buying $1 million or even $2 million worth of liability insurance or product liability insurance for selling watermelons into one of the big box stores or something. It doesn't cost $100,000. It doesn't. Sometimes it costs less than $1,000 to have that coverage insurance. So the cost compared to the potential benefit is great. It's great, and so that can be really important. And so I wanted to share that with you all today. We talked a little bit about multiple channels marketing a few minutes ago. Very quickly, you can use multiple market channels or a single market channel to manage your market risk. Almost every single product that you can think of has multiple market channels. And a market channel is simply one place to sell a good, right? So it could be the grocery store, it could be a restaurant, it could be direct to at a farmer's market. It could be an honor box and a table full of sweet corn outside your farm gate. that's a market channel. Picking and managing the right one or ones is critical. Do you sell your grain or do you store your grain? That's a way to control that market channel. Do you hold your animals and let them, or do you sell your animals now? Do you send them to the feedlot, or do you raise them a little more and then send them to the feedlot, or sell them directly? Or do you? Those are great questions. What about direct versus indirect markets? Multiple farmers markets or restaurants? Do we have one or do we have more than one? The more markets you can sell into, the more your risk is spread out. If you go too many for your operation, then you run into other risks about business management, because now you're trying to keep too many plates in the air. So that's an issue. CSAs and value-added products, those are market channels. If you've got tomatoes that are a little misshapen, or those eggplants with the noses on them that we get when we grow eggplant, you can turn that into a value-added product probably, and salvage what would be a less sellable product into one that is. Wholesale channels, we talked about that a little bit. There's lots of wholesale channels, from local grocery chains to national grocery chains to processors and handlers of fruits and vegetables. Farm to institution, farm to school, farm to hospital, farm to nursing homes, farm to the military, farm to the government, all that stuff. And of course, the processors are there too. Is having one channel better than having more than one? That's for you to decide. In general, if you only have one channel, you're kind of at the mercy of that channel. If you have a few channels, that's usually good. If you have too many, again, it's too many plates in the air. If you only have one or just a couple, are you ready, or can you be ready to pivot if needed? The pandemic has shown us a lot of that. Market channels came and went in minutes. Farmers markets blew up. Farmers markets and direct to consumer produce deliveries, they took off. And they're still higher than they were at the baseline of 2019. But is that going to last forever? Maybe, maybe not. But a lot of the wholesale markets, some of the wholesale markets dried up. The wholesale market for some of the meats, people just weren't running out to the store. And so they weren't buying stuff. And then certain plants closed and they weren't buying any. Processing plants for meat cutters and stuff, the whole plant closed. So there were tens of thousands of animals could not be processed. So those animals had to sit someplace in a feedlot or wherever it is. Can you afford that risk? Do you understand that risk? What about product choice? One product has more risk than two, but 50, just like these plates of channels, 50 could have more risk than 20. So you have to manage that risk too. So you need to build a product portfolio, which is the same as a collection or a group of products that's well branded and fits all together. When you think about it, Tabasco had their red sauce as their only product for decades. That was it. It was red Tabasco hot pepper sauce. That's it. That's all they had. Now they have several different products. And they certainly have oodles of different packaging sizes and containers. Campbell's soup, they started with just a few products. They didn't start with one, they started with a few. But they have hundreds and hundreds of varieties of products that they sell, and not just soup anymore. And Campbell's is now part of something else too, but that's a different story. But you have to be able to manage these things. Whatever you do, be consistent in your brand presentation. If you've got logos and labels and names, make sure they are used correctly, often, and sincerely, and never presented in a bad light or in a misrepresentation of what you want your brand to be. You can have different brands for different channels. That's very common in the larger industry. It's very common to have an A brand and a B brand. And the A brand is sold to this set of customers, and the B brand is sold to this set of customers. And they're never mixed up, because what's represented by the B brand is not what the A brand wants. What's represented by the A brand is not what the B brand wants. Never disparage any customer or any competitor in all these markets. And never skimp on your compliance and customer service. Those are all part of market risk management. Getting close to the end here. I'm almost done. You can never have enough information or knowledge. So learn and study. Know your farm, know your products, know your suppliers, know your regulators and regulations, know your market and other markets around, know your competitors. Plan and be ready for executing and for change. These are some of the references that helped me make the presentation. I can provide this to you another time. I'll please do that. I want to thank you. There's my name and contact information. I'm going to hand it back to Rock, and we'll see what we go from here. Thank you all very much.
Okay. Someone said we tend to price according to the Googling of our competition, similar growing methods and quality versus actual cost of labor inputs. Sometimes I wonder if it's equitable.
And that's a great question. And equity can mean different things to different people. But I will say this from a marketing point of view and from a business point of view. However you decide to price, remember that you're entitled to make a living. You're entitled to make a living. And if you can't make a living at the prices that your market allows you to sell at, then you can't be in that market anymore. We're not charities in farming. I tell farmers all the time, I want you to grow your business enough that you can afford to pay your mortgage with this and send your kids to college and maybe take your family on a vacation in the wintertime, if that's what you want to do. And if that is what you want to do, then you have to price your goods accordingly. There are pricing strategies, the bundling I talked about. Many farmers sell at the farmers market by the pound, but if you sell by the piece, then you can hide some of the pound things. You don't want to be, you can Google competitors' prices. There are national wholesale prices listed for those in the wholesale markets. There's no reason why you can't walk around and send someone to walk around the farmer's market to find out what other people are charging. And again, you can look at Facebook places to see what other people are charging for stuff in the local markets and things. If you do not understand your costs and all of your costs, then you need to do that. I would say that. You need to understand your costs so that you can generate a fair price to you and to the marketplace. People ask me all the time, I get 30 miles to the gallon, but the government pays me 56 cents a mile to drive my car when I'm on government business. Why is that? Because that would work out to 56, that's $15 a mile, that's $15 a gallon. Well, the fuel is only part of the cost of the car, and the government is paying you for all of that cost, paying you for the insurance, the tires, the oil changes, the gasoline, and the replacement value of the diminished value of the miles you drove. So if an average car gets 250,000 miles and it costs, $25,000, that's 10 cents a mile right there in depreciation costs on the car, plus the fuel costs out, et cetera. So understand all of your fixed and variable costs. Most commodities and most extension services serving these commodities have wonderful what are called enterprise budgets. And they allow you to write down and see relative costs, the cost of all your sprays, the cost of your equipment, the cost of your supplies, the cost of your labor, how many hours it takes to harvest a bushel or cut a hayfield, whatever it is. All those costs actually, believe it or not, within reason are known. And certainly the spreadsheets to assess those costs are available. And so you can take your known costs and plug them in there. So that can help.
Where can I find this enterprise budget tool?
Where can you find these tools? Great question. Hit me up with my email, and Rock will throw that back up at the end, or you can reach out to Rock and he'll have my contact information. It's Bill at upandfarms.com. But if you go to your state extension service website or go to your county extension office and ask them to help you find locally valuable enterprise budgets for the things you're growing, they can help you do that. And I can certainly direct you to some of that from here. I'd be happy to do that.